So a year ago this week, Axel Rudakubana travelled to a dance class in Southport, Merseyside, and murdered 3 young girls. In the days afterwards, we saw some of the worst racial rioting that England has seen in decades. Tom, should we start off talking about this despicable, inexplicable crime? Because as tragic as it is, this is something that should have been prevented. Axel Rudakubana set off so many red flags, and none of them were really followed up.
No, absolutely. I think it became the line that was trotted out, which is that Rudakubana can slip through the net, which I think is completely incorrect. He was caught in the net multiple times. It's just nothing was ever done about it. I mean, people know about the fact that he was referred to prevent on 3 separate occasions, the kind of counter-radicalisation scheme, and yet was each time assessed and then essentially let loose again because of the fact that they couldn't pin him down to a specific ideology. He just seemed to be generally obsessed with violence. He had material on everything from IRA bombings through to genocide, through to Islamist terrorism. He, of course, was in possession of that Al-Qaeda training manual, but because they couldn't neatly fit him into one of these boxes, kind of computer said no, and that was it. I mean, that being said, Prevent is a relatively weak scheme in the grand scheme of things. He also had contact with the police. He was caught with knives on multiple occasions. He admitted to taking knives to school, and I think up to about 10 occasions at one particular point. He attacked a classmate with a hockey stick. He admitted, I think, to Childline at one point that he wanted to kill someone. I mean, this is
and he had a knife at the time, and he had planned to use it
at the time he broke that kid's wrist. Absolutely. So, and time again, it was of no consequence. Nothing was actually done. And part of that is just going to be incompetent systems failing and whatever. But you put that together with the number of horrific murders which have taken place, either as a consequence of mentally deranged individuals, Valdo Calacane in Nottingham a few years ago stabbing 3 people to death, or many of the Islamist terrorists, David Amos's murderer, who again was assessed by Prevent, and his assessor came to the conclusion that he was a nice young man and nothing else needed to be done. So when people say that they feel like the state is absolutely failing to keep people safe, even when there is red flag after red flag after red flag, this unfortunately is the most extreme and grim example of that, I would say.
And this time last year, Josh, when the news was spreading about this horrible crime, we didn't know the identity of the perpetrator. We didn't know the motive. We didn't really understand what was going on. But in that void, the police were, very keen not to say anything or divulge any details, and have been criticised for their sort of reticence to say what happened. Into that void came this misinformation that he was a Muslim asylum seeker, and in that context, all hell seemed to break loose.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of proves how necessary it is for there to be this free speech, for there to be this openness. Because if that information was available from the get-go, if they had just come out and instead of trying to control the situation, they of course made it much worse.
Yeah,
because they allowed that space and they allowed bad faith actors and rumors to enter it. So if they had just been honest and treated the British public like adults, then I think it would have been a very different response than what happened. So it's whether that lesson has truly been learned or will ever be learned. I don't know. Obviously, our rulers just think we're idiots.
Yeah, definitely. And Tom, the rioting, I think sometimes misremembered for how shocking it was. Some of the racial violence that was being meted out. There were protests, but these were not just protests.
No, absolutely. And the full extremity of it is horrifying when you relive it. There was obviously the attack on the mosque in Southport. There was attacks on mosques up and down the country. There was the attempts in Rotherham and elsewhere to push, burning wheelie bins into asylum hotels whilst blocking the emergency exits. Reports in other parts of the country of masked youths running around Asian areas, screaming racial slurs and smashing up windows. I mean, this was a real despicable, really disquieting upsurge in ethnic conflict and violence. It was obviously amongst an infinitesimally small section of the population. But that's something which obviously needs to be condemned. But I think, as we were talking about on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, in relation to, as we were approaching the anniversary of the riots, that's also obviously insufficient in trying to explore why society has come apart to the extent that it has, why we have created this space for extreme bigoted attitudes to curdle amongst the fringes. And I stress that the fringes rather than the broader sweep of society. that's something which really needs to be engaged with. The problem that we got after Southport was you had the establishment doing what it always does, which is blaming social media. The problem here is social media. The problem is that Elon Musk let Tommy Robinson back on, or the problem is that misinformation, full stop, was the issue. First of all, it's facile to suggest that free speech is in and of itself the problem if there are broader structural endemic problems within society which might have created this situation or at least exacerbated it. But it also has all these kind of censorious consequences. We did see that post-Southport riot crackdown. We did see the message coming from the very top of government, social media accounts, gov.uk screaming out, think before you post in the context of those riots. You had the Director of Public Prosecutions going on the news saying that even sharing potentially inflammatory material from the riots could lead to you being arrested. And we saw obviously very heavy sentences being meted out to people who, granted, tweeted absolutely or posted absolutely despicable things, Lucy Connolly being the most famous case of this. But it just seemed to get this problem entirely the wrong way around, as if I think what we saw in the wake of Southport was a refusal to look more deeply as to why this has happened, but also this recourse to, well, if the social media companies just tougher up their algorithms, if we just lock up more people, then this would never have happened. That's both obviously censorious in its impact, but also facile and a kind of displacement activity.
But it's also the opposite lesson, because you could argue that so much of the anger there, the frustration there, and again, to condemn where it goes into violence, and but was based though on a very real sense of gaslighting of decades of it, really. And that response was partly to that feeling of, again, being lied to and trying to be controlled for this greater good, but it having really the opposite impact.
No, absolutely. And it's worth saying that in terms of the people who were arrested for speech, there's a lot of those cases which we'll continue to learn about, I think. I mean, there's one gentleman, we interviewed him for Spike recently in a format that we'll release at some point in the future. Jamie Michael in Wales, who was brought up on charges of inciting racial hatred for a video that he posted after Southport. This was around the time that misinformation was circulating. He was talking about there being radicalised people in the asylum hotels, and he was just calling for the need for a public meeting, that we need security at schools, that we need security at parks, that we need to do something about illegal migration because it's a threat, which even absent Southport and the misinformation is clearly the case. If you look at the kinds of crimes that many people who have entered the country illegally have gone on to commit, he was hauled over the coals. I mean, he was arrested. He was thrown in custody for 17 days. He was only allowed home on a tag. It was only because of his own bloody mindedness that he pleaded not guilty, unlike many other people who were given the kind of standard police-provided solicitor who just told them to plead guilty in the hopes of a shorter sentence. And then because of that, the Free Speech Union found out about him, got the tag taken off. It actually went to trial, and he was acquitted in 17 minutes. He told us that his tea that he was drinking didn't even have time to cool before they were called back in to hear the verdict. So unanimous and swift was it that he clearly wasn't inciting hatred. And I think there'll be many more cases like that of people who were swept up in that really censorious, really extreme atmosphere, which was whipped up from the very top after those riots.
Definitely. And finally, Josh, it does feel like British society is still in a dire place. A year on from those riots, we've had protests around the asylum hotel issue in Epping. We've had some near here where we're recording in Canary Wharf. There is still a kind of growing public anger with the establishment. A lot of those sort of underlying problems that gave fuel to this have not been anywhere close to resolved. Maybe they're even worse.
No, because it's anybody who dares have any fears or concerns about illegal migration or any, it's still said to be far right, essentially. And I watched the video that you guys did around the corner, and I think that is as frustrating for people, this accusation of being far right, as the actual issue of young men coming and living near their homes who may not, arguably follow the same cultural norms. I'm saying it in the nicest possible way, but the fear for their children and daughters, and so that I think that is as much a motivating factor for that feeling of unrest, because it would be nice, I think, if people could just sort of people want to feel listened to, ultimately, not accused of something.